talk about slavery, the image that often comes to mind is the transatlantic slave trade, with ships crossing the ocean to the Americas. But there's another, much older, and in many ways more devastating chapter of this dark history that remains largely untold. The Arab slave trade. For over 13 centuries, from the 7th all the way to the 20th century, a different kind of human trafficking was taking place. One that would shape continents and erase entire lineages. It's a story of survival, immense suffering, and a history that has been almost completely silenced. Today, we're going to shed light on this forgotten tragedy. This wasn't a short-lived horror. It was a system that spanned more than a millennium. Historians estimate that between 14 and 17 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and transported across the vast Sahara Desert, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. Their destinations were North Africa, the Middle East, and the Arabian Peninsula. The sheer scale is staggering, rivaling the transatlantic trade in numbers, but the methods and consequences were horrifyingly unique. One of the most brutal and systematic practices of the Arab slave trade was the mass castration of African men. It is estimated that a staggering 80 to 90% of male captives were subjected to this horrific procedure. This wasn't just a random act of cruelty. It was a calculated strategy. The goal was to prevent them from having children, to stop the formation of any lasting African communities in the lands they were brought to. The operation itself was incredibly dangerous, with high mortality rates. For those who survived, it meant the end of their lineage. This is a primary reason why today, in many parts of the Middle East, you don't see large, distinct populations of African descent, unlike in the Americas. The male bloodline was systematically and intentionally severed. While African men were prevented from reproducing, African women faced a different, but equally tragic, fate. They were primarily enslaved for domestic service, and as concubines, they were forced to bear children for their Arab masters. These children were not considered part of an African community. They were integrated into Arab society. Over generations, this continuous process of assimilation meant that African features and cultural identity were slowly fading into the dominant culture. The lineage wasn't cut off like the men's, but it was absorbed and erased over time. This dual strategy of castrating men and assimilating the children of women ensured that a permanent, self-sustaining African diaspora could never take root. The journey itself was an ordeal of unimaginable terror. The Trans-Saharan slave routes were some of the most perilous on earth. Captives were forced to march for months across a scorching, unforgiving desert. They faced extreme heat during the day and freezing cold at night. Water was scarce, and food was barely enough to keep them alive. The mortality rates were catastrophic. It's estimated that anywhere from 20 to 30% of the enslaved people died on the journey. Some historical accounts suggest that on certain routes, the death toll could exceed 60%. The paths they walked became grim trails of death, littered with the bones of those who couldn't make it. These desert routes were, quite literally, paved with human remains, a silent, haunting testament to the immense loss of life. Upon arrival, the horror continued in the slave markets of cities like Cairo, Baghdad, and Zanzibar. Here, human beings were treated like livestock. They were put on display, inspected, and sold to the highest bidder. The inspections were particularly invasive and humiliating, especially for women. Their bodies were scrutinized in detail, their health and potential for bearing children assessed as if they were animals. This dehumanization was absolute. People were stripped of their names, their families, their dignity, and their very humanity, reduced to mere commodities to be bought and sold for profit and pleasure. So, how did this system persist for so long? A key factor was the economic incentive it created within Africa itself. The demand for slaves from the Arab world fueled a vicious cycle. Arab traders offered goods like guns, textiles, and other manufactured items in exchange for human beings. This created a powerful motive for some African kingdoms and local warlords to wage war on their neighbors, capturing people to sell them into slavery. It turned communities against each other, creating a state of constant conflict and instability. The introduction of firearms, in particular, dramatically escalated the violence, making slave raiding more efficient and more deadly. It was a tragic system where Africans were incentivized to enslave other Africans to meet an external demand. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the Arab slave trade is its near-total absence from our collective memory. Unlike the transatlantic trade, there are very few memorials, museums, or official days of remembrance dedicated to its victims. While the descendants of the transatlantic slave trade have formed vibrant communities in the Americas and have fought for recognition of their history, the descendants of the Arab slave trade are largely invisible. The systematic castration of men and the assimilation of children created what historians call a demographic black hole. The people are gone, and we tell their stories. It is a history that has been almost completely erased, not just from our textbooks, but from the physical and cultural landscape of the world. The end of this 13th century-long practice was not a swift or clear-cut event. The abolition of slavery in the Arab world was a slow, drawn-out process, largely driven by external pressure from European colonial powers in the 19th and 20th centuries. Even then, the practice often continued illegally for decades. Some countries didn't officially abolish slavery until incredibly recently. Mauritania, for example, only made it a crime in 2007. This long, slow, and often reluctant path to abolition means that the legacy of this trade lingers in subtle ways, even if its history is not openly acknowledged. The silence surrounding the Arab slave trade is profound. It is a story that challenges our understanding of history and forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about a past that is far more complex and global than we often imagine. By forgetting these 17 million people, by ignoring their suffering and the brutal efficiency of their erasure, we fail to understand the full scope of human history. Their story deserves to be told. Their memory deserves to be honored. It is our responsibility to break the silence and ensure that this devastating chapter is not forgotten. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but important journey into the past. Learning about these events helps us honor the victims and better understand the world we live in today. If you found this video insightful, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into forgotten history. See you next time.